Then reading became a developed form where it became shade. Shade is, I don't tell you you're ugly, but I don't have to tell you because you know you're ugly. And that's shade.
The word camp comes from the French word se camper, meaning to strike a bold or provocative posture or to strike a pose. The Oxford Dictionary defines the current English word to mean deliberately exaggerated and flamboyant in style, typically for humorous effect, or extravagantly flamboyant or affected in a way stereotypically associated with some gay men. It has origins with the early drag community and the LGBTQ community, but recently, due to increased popularity and commodification of queer culture, it has been appropriated by the mainstream and has been watered down to describe almost anything quirky, gaudy, or decorative. Drag started with wealthy Englishmen who had a hobby of cross-dressing, like John Cooper, who would frequent bars in his alter ego, Princess Seraphina, at a time when homosexuality was severely punished. One of the first drag queens in the United States, and the self-identified Queen of Drag, was William Dorsey Swan, a former slave and host of many drag balls. It is thought that the word drag originated from his circle, referring to the opulent and flamboyantly feminine dresses worn that were so heavy that they quite literally dragged on the floor as they walked. The history of drag kings dates back even farther. There is evidence of women dressing as men stretching back to Shakespeare's time, when female playwrights created specific roles in their plays for women impersonating men. Drag king Moby Dick complains that this was even more transgressive than drag queens, as men putting on dress is comedy, and women putting on a suit is still considered threatening towards the cis-hetero patriarchy. These drag balls often still had prevalent issues of racism, colorism, and were very much white-dominated despite the boom in black queer culture in Harlem in the 1920s. When a white contestant took the crown at the 1967 Miss All-America Camp beauty pageant, black contestant Crystal LaBeija declared the competition rigged and went on to start her own drag ball, creating the first ballroom house and leading it as the house mother. These houses evolved and multiplied into a parallel kind of drag culture known as ballroom, but members formed family units with mothers, fathers, children, etc., and focused on uplifting queer people from racial and ethnic minorities, especially Black and Latina people. They started with mostly trans women heading houses and participating in so-called balls, but eventually expanded to include male-presenting people and expanded the set of events to include more than just pageantry, like voguing, whacking, and lip-syncing. To help the not so proficient listener understand camp aesthetics better, I would be remiss to not show some examples within high fashion. When I think of camp, I think of high fashion, specifically Thierry Mugler, Alexander McQueen, and John Galliano. To me, their campiness is undeniable. The opulence, the extravagance, the blending of femininity and masculinity, and the silhouettes that throw the viewer back to the early 19th and 20th century fashion trends. It's over-the-top visuals for the sake of being over-the-top, without caring about practicality or conventional standards of beauty and style. Haute couture, in general, seems to embody this idea of transcending what is normal for the everyday, but only a few artists like these fully take advantage of the freedom to create, rather than just make. This opulence and seemingly aimless extravagance is also prevalent in fashion photographer David LaChapelle's work. LaChapelle was a highly influential fashion and fine art photographer in the 80s and 90s who was known for his surrealist and almost nonsensical photo shoots, which makes sense since he did cite artists like Salvador Dali as artistic inspiration. He doesn't shy away from vibrant, sometimes even clashing colors, and crams his pieces full of dynamic posing and maximalist-styled props. Some of his photos even play on religious themes and generally look like scenes from Cirque du Soleil or a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Since camp as a concept is relatively modern, there are few intentional and self-aware examples in filmography, and none that would explicitly identify themselves as camp. Mae West is one of the figureheads of camp and the reigning sex symbol of pre-Hays Code Hollywood. She wrote many of her own films and was known for her depiction of sexually liberated and independent women, many of whom held jobs, and her double entendres. She was and still does remain popular with old Hollywood enthusiasts, partly because of the notoriety she attracted, as well as her penchant for glittery floor-length gowns and flings with powerful men both on and off the big screen. The 90s aren't quite historical yet, but the documentary Paris is Burning is too significant in the documentation of the history of queer culture in America to not include in this video. It focuses on real-life icons of the ballroom scene explained in the introduction like Octavia St. Laurent, Willie Ninja, and Dorian Corey, and is praised for its documentation of a time when AIDS was devastating many queer spaces and there was not yet widespread social or political acceptance of the lifestyle. It is not without its criticisms, however. Notable feminist author Bell Hooks criticized the creation of the film as a spectacle for white viewers who were often not privy to ballroom and questioned the director's choice to not appear in the film, which has historically been problematic when it comes to pieces like ethnographic films, where the lack of appearance allows the creators to manipulate the way they portray certain subjects and social groups. In relatively recent years, camp has become synonymous and pretty much replaced with cult classic. Cult classic generally refers to media, specifically in this case films, that are shunned from the mainstream for subversive or taboo topics, but have a small and dedicated fan base that persists for those same reasons. 3 camp cult classics I watched for my research were Rocky Horror Picture Show, To Wong Foo with Love, Julie Newmar, and But I'm a Cheerleader. Rocky Horror is arguably the movie when we're talking about cult classics and camp and film just in general. Tim Curry plays a sweet transvestite doctor who dazzles the unsuspecting couple Brad and Janet with song, dance, and their outrageous personality. This has remained a staple not only because of the musical and visual aspects, like Dr. Frankenfurter's iconic garter set, but also because of the early depiction of trans people, specifically trans women. During this era, the only time you would see trans women in mainstream media was in the role of the murdered prostitute, the serial killer with womb envy, or the punchline of a joke involving men trying to dress like women. So this was a pretty monumental depiction, especially with them explicitly acknowledging Frankenfurter's gender fluidity several times throughout the movie. To Wong Foo with Love, Julie Newmar is Rocky Horror's younger, even better, but much less well-known cousin. It paints an intimate but still fun picture of the life of 3 New York drag queens who travel across the country to compete in a beauty pageant in Hollywood, and the people they meet in a redneck town that their car breaks down in partway through the journey. I'm going to use both drag queen and trans woman kind of interchangeably in this section because back in this time, the common word was transsexual, but it would only refer to people who had gotten the full gender reassignment surgery, and there was not yet a real widespread use of the word transgender, so many trans people who did not get the surgeries were just referred to as drag queens, butch lesbians, or something along those lines. It features big names like Wesley Snipes and Patrick Swayze, who were known for very masculine and tough guy acting roles as two of the main drag queens. When watching the film and seeing interviews of the actors preparing for the role, you can see that they treated the subject and their characters with the due respect and didn't play them as a parody or make them the punchline, like how most drag queens, trans women, and queer people were and still are portrayed. They worked with actual drag queens to learn the proper way to talk and carry themselves, and talked about how important they felt doing the characters of Vida and Noxima justice. But I'm a Cheerleader is the newest of these three, featuring everyone's favorite lesbian icon, who isn't actually a lesbian in real life, Natasha Lyonne. She plays a cheerleader whose parents send her to a sexual redirection camp, where she ironically enough finds a girlfriend and helps her and several others escape from the camp, and realizes being gay is not necessarily a bad thing. Most of the campiness from the film comes from the very pastel and sort of 50s idealistic suburban aesthetic, and the very unserious, happy-go-lucky characters juxtaposed with the fact that these parents have sent their children to a literal conversion camp. It is one of the few relatively earlier films that actually focuses on lesbians and not just gay men and shows them in a spectrum of different identities and aesthetics. There are roughly 3 categories of camp media: iconic camp, retrospective camp, and self-conscious camp. Iconic camp focuses on the individuals exalted and loved by the queer community for their drama and personas. This can overlap with self-conscious camp in cases of figures like Lady Gaga and Mae West, who knew they were iconic and lean into the glamour and theatricality of it all. But most are not aware of this and fall into the category of unintentional camp, like Joan Crawford and Jane Fonda. Unintentional camp is a sort of 4th category that can overlap with retrospective and iconic camp, but I'm just going to stick to the original 3 for now. Elvira is an example of a camp icon both on screen and in real life. The movie Elvira, Mistress of the Dark is based on and features the real-life horror hostess Cassandra Peterson, who hosted a weekly showing of horror B-movies on cable television. She was so beloved by her loyal audience that several spin-off movies and other pieces of media were based off of her, including this movie. Her whole persona is if you combined a hyper-feminine valley girl with a trad goth rocker. She is unapologetically herself even when it puts her at odds with the conservatives in the town she is staying in, and is fully committed to the bit. With a lot of these camp icons, it is not completely a stage persona, and many of these people use their personas as an outlet or a form of expression that is similar to drag queens and their alter egos. Retrospective camp is, more often than not, completely unintentional. It is camp that would not have been really considered at the time it was created, but current audiences have looked back to it and labeled it as such. Most of the camp from the genre comes from the retro feeling and aesthetics of the movies from this era, combined with the prevalence of unique plot lines that we rarely see the likes of in current media. Barbarella was criticized at its release for being flat, boring, exploitative, and pure adolescent junk. Other than the draw of Jane Fonda playing the titular character, audiences saw little to like, and the few tries at comedy and satire didn't seem to land. The voices praising it seemed to be in the minority. Contemporary critics seem to appreciate its kitsch more, and note that, despite the slightly outdated takes on gender and sex, it reflects the free and fluid thinking that sparked the sexual revolution in the 60s, which has extended to today. The movie was considered to be retro-futuristic even at the time of release, but has design elements that are undeniably and uniquely 60s. The charisma of Jane Fonda, combined with the dreamlike landscape of the film, makes it alluring and draws in consumers of so-called cult classics. Self-conscious camp overlaps with iconic camp, as most camp icons of the modern day, and a few from the past, have embraced and even seek the notoriety and idolization of the label, like Lady Gaga, Billy Porter, and Arca. But it does not necessarily need an idol to rotate around. The most well-known self-conscious camp film is undoubtedly Pink Flamingos, directed by John Waters. It features counterculture drag queen Divine, who, fun fact, was the inspiration for Ursula in the animated Little Mermaid movie. So Divine plays a notorious criminal who is competing with another criminal couple for the title of Filthiest Person Alive. To get the idea of the contents of the film, it was rated NC-17 by the MPAA and banned in Australia, Norway, Canada, and Switzerland upon release. Despite the extremely graphic nature of the film, It was extremely popular from the beginning, with not only queer, but working class and poor audiences. It is considered an essential part of the new queer cinema wave, a precursor to the punk scene, and was even inducted into the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress in December of 2021. In American film culture, and just North American/Western media culture in general, we tend to limit ourselves and impose restrictions onto what kind of stuff we can enjoy and from where we can consume things. Even when we move outside the bubble of American, Canadian, British, Australian film, we still tend to stick with English language films or only explore Western European language films. The overall impression is that real film, or film that can be considered on the level of art, only comes from civilized Western countries and cultures. So I wanted to specifically have a section of my research in my video that focused on film that was not produced in Anglo countries, with non-Anglo directors and cast members from a variety of countries. I found it surprisingly hard to find films that could fall under the camp category that I hadn't already watched, and unfortunately couldn't find anything from Indigenous or African artists, and barely one from Latin America. Most were from European countries and Asia, who is kind of heading the popularity of foreign films in the West and America. Japanese film has grown in both prestige and popularity over the years, and in my opinion has developed a unique cinematic style that makes it distinct and instantly recognizable from other countries' productions. They delve hard into the psychological without sacrificing aestheticism, humor, and style. Funeral Parade of Roses and Helter Skelter are two of these kinds of films that explore the psychological degradation of the main characters' lives through their romantic and familial relationships and obsession with personal appearances and struggles of identity. Funeral Parade focuses on Eddie, a transgender woman who wants to become the madame or leading lady of the gay bar she works at that is run by her much older boyfriend, Gunda. Spoiler ahead, at the end of the film, Gunda finds an old picture of Eddie with her parents and realizes she is the child that he abandoned and kills himself, and when Eddie finds his body with the picture, she blinds herself with the same knife. It is a theme and gender subversion of the Oedipus myth, that also has documentary clips of the cast being interviewed about their identity and explores the underground bar and avant-garde scene of Tokyo through the lens of Japanese new wave cinema. Helter Skelter follows Liliko, a fashion model who obsessively gets risky illegal plastic surgeries at the prompting of her mom to keep up with her literally decaying body and the extreme public pressure she is under. We follow her mental spiral, and it is reflected in her personal and work relationships, as well as her physical body. It is full of vibrant and jarring imagery contrasted with minimalistic photoshoot sets and the clinical cleanliness of the plastic surgery clinic and police interrogation room. It doesn't shy away from showing the ugliness of Liliko's behavior despite her obvious outward beauty and good reputation, and how the fame rots her from the inside out. As a final thought, I just wanted to add how camp as a concept is extremely Western and centered around Anglo-American cultures and values, and when we move outside of that sphere, it's harder for us to distinguish what is and isn't subversive by other cultural standards, and we tend to let our bias dictate and overpower the voices of others. Some of which we consider to be campy in the US is just normal cinema for people in other countries or just their standard of entertainment. I wanted to do a short segment on camp in television, as it is absolutely rampant with unintentional camp. Because of a combination of the funding of individual episodes being much less than that of movies, and the dependency on ratings and viewers to allow the show to continue being produced on an episode-to-episode basis, there are a lot more outlandish as well as downright bad TV shows out there on official channels compared to movies. Glee falls under this description of a bad TV show that desperately needed the viewers and, through stumbling around with several plot devices, somehow became extremely popular with the queer community. It has several problematic, almost caricatures of minorities on the show and makes jokes that probably shouldn't have been made considering everyone in the writing room was white and most were men. But the comedy of every single character only being taken seriously by themselves and not everyone else, and the fact that they burst into song every 5 minutes, as well as the contributions of the iconic Sue Sylvester, has helped it reach almost cult classic status, which is not well heard of when it comes to television series. On the other side of things, Pose is a show that is made by queer people, about queer people, for a queer audience, and is just as popular. It is hyper-focused on the ballroom scene, a subculture of LGBT culture I talked about in the introduction, and puts Black and Latino trans women and gay men of the 80s and 90s in the spotlight. It affords them the attention and respect they deserve and have not been given for the past decades, and shows how they really are the foundation of the queer community and activism in the United States. I just wanted to really quickly go over some movies that I absolutely loved, but I didn't have time to go in depth about in this video. Lair of the White Worm was my absolute favorite of all the movies I watched for my research, and has definitely made my top 10 list. If you love vampire horror, fantasy, phallic/religious imagery, and Peter Capaldi, then I highly recommend you check this one out. Dracula 2000 is another very good vampire horror movie. It has everything good about 2000's film, and features Gerard Butler as a very charismatic Count Dracula. Batman and Robin reminded me of DC's glory days and was quite the subversive take on a superhero action movie, which is to be expected considering the director was a gay man. And finally, the Hellboy duology is an example of director Guillermo del Toro's best work in direction, production, and character design, and reminded me of how good superhero movies could have been if we had not turned to the overproduced commercial style of films. Anyways, thank you for watching my video essay, and if any of the movies I talked about piqued your interest, or if you're just a general film buff, stay a little longer for my recommendations of movies that I didn't quite get to in my research for this video, and past watches that I think could help expand your repertoire of camp filmography.
I think if I could just be on TV or film or anything, I'd do that instead of the money. Of course, I do want the money because I want the luxury that goes with it. But I want to be wealthy. If not wealthy, content, comfortable. You know? I want to be somebody. I mean, I am somebody. I just want to be a rich somebody.